Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go, here we go.
Now let's get to the 90s and phase 2 then. This is essentially the phase when the Gospel of John was written. If we read the Gospel of John, what does that tell us maybe about that community during the 90s? Again, we're lumping all the Jews together and calling them the Jews, right? Since the Jews were considered blind and unbelieving, and we see that in verses 37 to 40 of chapter 12, the coming of the Greeks was seen as the fulfillment of God's plan. So all of this Greek philosophy and everything, the Word was made flesh. You know what? If the Jews don't acknowledge Jesus, there are the Greeks who are talking about the Word. You follow me? And so even if the Jews are rejecting Jesus, I got news for you. The Greeks seem to be more friendly to Jesus than the Jews. Members of the community may have moved from Palestine to Greek-speaking parts, so there may have, as part of this diaspora, right? People were in Jerusalem after the temple was destroyed. Jews were in many other parts. Same with Christians, right? Christians started out there in Palestine, but Christians spread to other Greek-speaking places. Perhaps to Ephesus. And when they were in other places that were Greek-speaking and didn't know Palestine, then they had to start explaining some of the words that they're using. Jesus is the Messiah. Do you remember Messiah? Is Messiah a Greek word? Messiah is a Hebrew word, meaning the oiled one. The oiled one. That doesn't make any sense. What do you mean Jesus was the oiled one? Oh, well, the Jews were waiting for the Messiah, the oiled one, the anointed one, who would come and save them. Okay, so we have to start translating some of those phrases, which is not what's happening in the Gospel of John. We're taking some of those phrases like rabbi, and we have to tell people what rabbi means. Rabbi, or teacher, right? Messiah, or the Christ, the anointed one. We have to tell people what some of these Palestinian words mean. And now that we're in a Greek-speaking world, we're also speaking to a larger audience. We're not just talking to our Palestinian friends. We're trying to come up with this message that's more universal, that deals with Jesus saving all people. Jesus didn't come just for the Jews and the Palestinians. The resulting rejection and persecution of Christians, because Christians were rejected and Christians were persecuted, right? People like Mario, who was expelled from the synagogue, they were persecuted. And they were convinced that the world, like the Jews, was opposed to Jesus, and that the world was under the power of Satan, the prince of this world. So that, for instance, in chapter 17, we see one example of how it is that in verses 15 and 16, Jesus says, he's talking to God the Father, I do not ask that you take them out of the world, but that you keep them from the evil one. They do not belong to the world any more than I belong to the world. It's sort of like Satan, the evil one, has this world. They don't belong to the evil one or to this world, in the same way that I don't. It's sort of like this perception of how it is that the world is evil. There are other verses that hint at the world being evil and under Satan's power as well. Some of these Christians had such an inadequate Christology that they were really unbelievers. That's suggested in chapter 6. How it is, for instance, chapter 6 is all about the bread of life discourse. And so in verses 60 to 66, many of the disciples were saying, what we're hearing about Jesus pre-existing and being God is hard to accept. Who can accept this? What did they do? What does that story say? They left. Verse 66, as a result of this, many of Jesus' disciples left and returned to their former way of life and no longer walked with him. Was that really talking about Jesus and the early disciples? Or was that a story about us, the community? You follow me? How it was that there are certain people in the community who, when we're talking about Jesus pre-existing and being the Word with a capital W, and Jesus being God, they couldn't accept that. There's the door. There's some people who left. This story about Jesus is really the story about us, the community. Others who were symbolized by Peter in the Gospel. So Peter could be a symbol as well. Many of these figures, rather than thinking of it as history, things that Peter really said and did, it's really about us. Peter is us as well. So Peter truly believed in Jesus, but wasn't as perceptive as the beloved disciple. Remember, the beloved disciple is the one who saw inside the tomb, he saw the cloth, he saw and he believed. Boom. Are you more like the beloved disciple, or are you more like Peter, the one who denied Christ, the one who needed to be reconciled with Christ? How does these figures represent different ones of us here in the community? The hope persisted that this division might be healed and that all might be one. Chapter 10 in John's Gospel is the Good Shepherd discourse. And so we see there in chapter 10 how it is that Jesus prays to God, saying, I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. These also I must lead, and they will hear my voice, and there will be how many flocks? One flock. In the independent Catholic tradition, we point to this phrase, right? Because, I don't know about you, when I was part of the Roman Catholic Church for so many years, it was like, if you're going to be saved, you have to be part of the Roman Catholic Church. Roman Catholic Church, Roman Catholic Church. What does it first say? Wait a minute. I have other sheep who are not part of this flock? Whoa. That is a challenge. Do you think that God's sheep might be outside of the Catholic Church or outside of the Christian religion, or however we want to look at these things? How it is that God's intended to bring all people together in one? What was that story really about? Less about Jesus and the first disciples, more about us and our community. Even though our community is now divided, how it is that Jesus wanted us all to be one. The Gospel's one-sided emphasis on the divinity of Jesus. So remember that John has a very high Christology, where Jesus is God. And so this emphasis on Jesus' divinity, Jesus being God, this one-sided emphasis on the divinity and on the commandment of love opened up the way for the next generation of believers to have some really exaggerated views about Jesus. Exaggerated views like what? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. Reality or myth, a person like Bultmann would ask. Is that just the story, or is that really how Jesus is? Right? It was obviously how it was that this, in the early community, there were people who believed this, in this high Christology of pre-existence of the Son. That's phase 2. Phase 3 then begins about 100 AD. Phase 3 then is about the time when the first and second letters of John were written, because we know that there are different letters that were attributed to John. The first 2 were written about that time, and at that time, the first 2 letters of John are talking about a split in the community. So now, before, in the Gospel of John, we're talking about how it is that one day we'll all be one. That's our prayer. Right now we're divided. Maybe one day we'll all be one. The first letter of John talks about this division as well. What's the division? It's all about who is Jesus. Some clung to this high Christology. Jesus is God. Jesus is God. Half the room was saying, Jesus is God. The other half of the room was screaming, wait a minute, people. Jesus was human like us. And he was a great ethical teacher teaching us to love one another. And the room was divided into these 2 factions. And somehow we prayed that we'd one day be one. But in the meantime, we're having some pretty tense conversations about who Jesus is. Some people are believing this high Christology. Others of us are seeing Jesus as a good ethical teacher and Davidic Messiah that we believed him to be. Others, so some stuck to the view of John, of the first and second letter of John, stressing Jesus' humanity and his ethical teachings. The others with this exaggerated view of Jesus' divinity. And many of them seceded, which means what? They left. In this yelling fight that we had going across the room. Those with the humanity of Jesus were saying Jesus is more like us than different from us. Our question in Christology is, was Jesus different in kind or degree? Half of the room, Jesus is human like us, was saying he was different in terms of degree. The other was saying, no, he's different in terms of kind. Jesus was the Word. Jesus was God. He's a different kind of thing from us. What happened in the end? Those are the ones who left the room. And in John's letters then, we use words of them like the Antichrists. Those who had this high Christology. This is hard to take in here. These are things that keep me awake at 2 o'clock in the morning. The ones with the high Christology, Jesus is God, are the ones whom in John's letters are the Antichrists. They seceded and are referred to in the first letter of John as children of the devil because they were neglecting Jesus' humanity and his ethical teachings. And that's what the community was focusing on. The challenge was, though, that the community had no disciplinary structure, meaning we didn't excommunicate anyone back then. We didn't have bishops with pointy hats who could write letters and say, you are excommunicated, you antichrists. And so we simply had to pray, as in the letter of John, that people would test the truth by the spirits. Pray to God and you'll know the truth. Right? And if those antichrists, those children of the devil, who have that high exalted Christology of Jesus being God, if they prayed, they would come to see the truth as well. That's phase 3, about the time of 100 AD when John, the first and second letters of John are being written. The third phase then, 100 to 110, is really when we start to bring all these things together with John chapter 21. Remember, that was written by someone else. And the third letter of John, that was written by someone else. How does these start to draw the threads together in this tapestry? Where the Johannine community disintegrated, we prayed that we'd be one. You know what? We're no longer one. The community disintegrated with those more sympathetic to the human Jesus being closer to what today is known as the Catholic Church. How fascinating that is. Because as a church, in the councils, we would formulate a creed about how it is that Jesus is true God and true, this very high Christology. In the end of this discussion with the Johannine community, those who were orthodox were those who had the more human view of Jesus, who emphasized his humanity, who emphasized his ethical teachings, how it is we should get along with one another. Not those who emphasized Jesus as God, which was the emphasis of the Council of Nicaea. So by the time of these writings, instead of relying on the Spirit, because before we were just saying, oh, if you just pray to God, the Spirit will show you the truth. Just pray to God and the Spirit will show you. No. By the time of the third letter of John, we're moving to these structures in the church, for instance, with bishops. So that, for instance, in the talk of this Diotrephes, who is Diotrephes, who's mentioned in that letter? We have no idea. But we're imagining that he may have been one of those early overseers of the church, one of the first bishops, if you will, who now, even though we don't speak about him so kindly in that letter, we recognize that he's over the community. And so where are we going to start looking for truth? Are we going to start trusting the Spirit to speak through different people? Or are we going to start looking to certain people for wisdom? You know what I mean? Brings to mind a certain Facebook post that I made probably within the last 2 weeks. How I did I typed something and someone else types back this strong diatribe on how it is that, you know, if you just pray, God will show you the truth, and God revealed to me that this is the truth. Okay, that's a very Spirit-filled theology, right? That if you pray to God, the Spirit will show you the truth, and I prayed to God, and this is what God showed me, and I know that this is the truth. Oh, okay. Do we go with that sort of theology of the Spirit from the first and second letters of John? Or once these structures start emerging, that's essentially what bishops were in charge of in the early church, was making sure that we stuck to something that resembles the truth, rather than every person having his or her own truth. Okay, what can we all believe, and how does that fit with the truth? This would bring the Johannine Christians into the church, and it would preserve our heritage, simply because we recognize with people like Diotrephes then, you know, perhaps this bishop or somehow this early leader, how it is that even if we don't like him, even if he's a bit authoritarian and authoritative, how it is that by being one with him, that's what preserved our history in the church. We didn't go out being some other separate group, but instead we were part of this group that would later become Christian, the Catholic Church. Instead of those who left, because those who had an exaggerated emphasis on the divinity of Christ, Jesus is God, Jesus is God, Jesus is God. Wait a minute. Many of them fell into Docetism, where Jesus really was God, but only seemed human. That's a heresy. That he only seemed human, that he was really God, but he only seemed human. Others of them became Gnostics, which is simply, I believe that the world is so evil, right? And the world is this evil place, that an alien Savior is going to come down to this evil world and save us and take us to wherever he's going. Gnosticism. Others came into Montanism. We remember the name Tertullian. He became a Montanist late in life, and a great defender and apologist of the church. Then he became a Montanist. The Montanists were looking to Montanus, the founder of that movement, as this one who is filled with the Spirit and guiding the church. The Spirit spoke to Montanus. Let's listen to Montanus. So essentially all that simply to say, what we're seeing then is in the Gospel of John and in the first, second, and third letters of John, written in this time period of 100 to 110 AD, we see how it is that those works may tell us a lot about that early community, maybe even more so about that community than about Jesus and the first disciples. Remember, the Bible is not a book of history. It's a book of theology, what we believe about God. This book tells us a lot about what that early community believed about God and what was going on in their community. The division that existed, how they wished they would all be one. Did Jesus really talk about how we'll all be one day? Or did someone put those words onto Jesus' lips? That Jesus said, you know, people were fighting right now, but Jesus said, one day my hope is that you'll all be one. I have sheep who are not part of this flock. They walked out the door. The dream is that one day we'll all be one. Did the historical Jesus really say those words? Or did someone writing several years later say that Jesus said those words in the hope of bringing us together again?